Hello and welcome to today's webinar with On24 and DT Consulting, an Indogene company, the state of customer experience in the global pharmaceutical industry. I'm Cherie Hulse, Vice President of Strategy and Research at On24, and it's my pleasure to have Hannah and Dominic from DT Consulting joining me for this research-packed event. Before we begin, I do want to go over a few housekeeping points. The On24 experience we are in today can be completely customized to you. You can alter the size of the multimedia viewer or the slide window. Feel free to drop questions into the Q&A section. We do have time set aside today to make sure that we are answering the questions that you may have. And over in the resources section are where the slides and other associated content is located. So I know you will be asking for these slides. They are there for you. We have reactions enabled, so feel free to give us a thumbs up on the content. And you can also talk with your fellow attendees. So you'll need to expand the chat functionality that you see along the widget bar. And if you're interested to learn more about how On24 can support your HCP digital engagement initiatives, you can also request a demo here today. Now, finally, we are always looking for feedback on our sessions to make sure that we are delivering the great experience and content that you need in order to do your jobs better. So feel free to fill out our survey that we have. This will help us decide on future topics as well. Now, without any further ado, it is my pleasure to turn it over to Dominic and Hannah, and we're excited to hear what you have to share with us today.
Thanks very much, Cherie. So welcome everyone. My name is Dominic Tyre. I'm a research director at DT Consulting, covering commercial operations within the pharmaceutical industry. And I'm here with my colleague, Hannah Price, who is our Senior Director of Customer Experience. So first, just a little bit of obligatory introductory information about DT Consulting. We're a strategy consultancy firm specializing in the life sciences sector. And we work with organizations from strategy to execution throughout the digital transformation lifecycle. We're also part of the Indogene Group. So I'm going to start off by diving straight in to pick out some of the detail from our most recent customer experience report. So in a minute, we'll go through some of the background around the research and what it's based on, and certainly dive into a little bit more detail for our CXQ metric that a lot of this particular research is based around. But I wanted to start off with one of the headline findings from our study, and that is that overall, the customer experience that pharmaceutical companies are providing to healthcare professionals is about average. It's certainly, when we look at our CXQ scores, a score of 59 across all of the companies, all of the countries, all of the markets involved in this most recent global study, does give it a good ranking, but it's not a particularly strong good ranking, and it's certainly some way away from the excellent experiences that I know pharmaceutical companies are aiming to provide to their stakeholders. So if we dive into some of the background and more detail around this particular study then. So we've been running these customer experience quotient studies since 2017. And many of them, as this particular one does, assess the customer experience of interactions between various pharmaceutical companies and healthcare professionals. Now, the data that we'll be presenting today and the report we're talking about is based on fieldwork that was conducted last year between July and September. So for most of the countries involved, they were transitioning out of COVID restrictions. I know it's probably a little bit early still to be talking about a post-pandemic world, but this is a time when countries are beginning to move towards that post-acute phase of the COVID restrictions. And in terms of what the study's doing, the healthcare professionals are ranking individual firms, also the content they create, and then the channels they use to deliver that content. And then when we talk about, you'll hear quite a bit, of course, around CXQ scores and our customer experience quotient. So just to tell you a little bit about that before we move on to some more of the findings. So the CXQ essentially measures perceptions that your customers have around their interactions with your company. And it's based on 3 key attributes. So those are, as you can see in front of you, trust, relevance, and simplicity. And we've chosen those because time and again in our research, those are the 3 things that healthcare professionals say are most important to them when they're thinking around the customer experience that the industry can provide. So in this particular study, healthcare professionals were rating their 2 most recent interactions with a pharma company. It's important to note they're coming at it first from the point of view of the interaction and then relating that back to which company was involved. So it's not a survey of particular pharmaceutical companies necessarily. It's talking around interactions first and then working out the content and the channel that those involved, and of course the pharmaceutical company as well. So let's look at some more findings from the study then. So certainly we do see substantial differences between countries. Most of them were achieving a good score for customer experience, though by no means all were at that level. Just looking at this picture, it's interesting to note that China, being the only country during the time period of the research that was still in deep lockdowns, had very restrictive conditions in place, even with that in mind, was still able to produce the same or very similar level of customer experience to that seen in markets like France and Germany. Now, of course, we would recognize that there would be differences in terms of response styles between different countries related to cultural norms. So this is the first time we've conducted this study on such a global basis. So personally, I'm really looking forward to the next time we run it and we can get some trending data for all of the countries involved. Historically, we've looked at the biggest European markets and North America. So if we isolate just that group, we can see evidence of both a dip during the COVID years in terms of the customer experience provided, but also then a recovery back to those pre-COVID levels. So it's not to say that the pharmaceutical industry has exceeded the customer experience it was providing pre-COVID, but it's at the very least appears to be back at similar sorts of levels. Now, in addition to quite a wide variety of scores on a country basis, we also see the same sort of thing when we cut out the data in terms of the different therapy areas involved. And with that wide 10 percentage point difference between the best performing therapy area and the worst performing therapy area, we can see that there's an awful lot for different companies involved with interests in those therapy areas to be thinking about. So looking at what that means on a company basis, and certainly we see UCB, Gilead, and Novo are leading companies. We see particularly for UCB, it seemed to be rewarded for the simplicity and relevance of the content it was providing. And then we see Gilead moving up from the 6th place that it held in the previous year's study up to 3rd. So perhaps an interesting pointer in terms of the difference that can be made when a company really tries to focus in on CX. But overall, and we'll see this in a number of the ranking slides, as you can see from the very small differences between the companies here, it's an area where there's a very high level of competition. We've got about a third of the companies are within perhaps 5% percentage points of each other. So going back to the comment about Gilead, it's certainly an area where companies that are able to prioritize customer experience may well see large rewards from that as they're able to differentiate themselves from their competitors. So the previous slide was looking at the company rankings across all of the channels, but we also split them out into digital and non-digital channels. So starting first of all with a look at the rankings in terms of how companies were performing in their use of all of the digital channels available to them. And we see at a company basis, BMS doing far better in its use of digital channels than it was on the previous slide, whereas some way behind in its overall rankings. And this was particularly aided by its the company's medical reps and their use of digital channels. Whilst in those joint second place rankings of Boehringer and Merck, we see that there it was particularly content provision that appeared to be above average in those two companies. But again, that trend of very close competition continues in this slide, as you can see. Turning now to the picture in terms of non-digital channels, by and large a different set of front runners here. And again, we can see, as we did in the previous slide with BMS, that we might have a company that's doing very well in terms of digital, but not so well in terms of its non-digital use. Whereas on this slide, we see that Novo's leading use of non-digital channels is actually pulling up its overall ranking. Meanwhile, I'd like to call out Pierre Fabre as well for the almost excellent score it received in terms of trustworthiness, one of those key 3 attributes of the CXQ score we mentioned, along with relevance and simplicity. So turning now to what that actually means on a channel basis. So again, as we mentioned, we tend to split these out into digital and non-digital channels. And the headline finding here is that it's this human use of technology, this sort of hybrid approach, really, that's at the moment providing the best level of customer experience. And we start to see also hints of a trend we'll see across some of the other channels, where whilst it's reps' use of video calls that's performing the best, medical reps on a global basis are providing a better level of customer experience than their counterparts in sales. And we can see that trend repeated across some of the other digital channels here. One thing to call out additionally would be the position of virtual events. Clearly, we all know that how convenient virtual events are, such as this one today. In our previous COVID era study, it was virtual events that were providing healthcare professionals with the highest level of customer experience. And whilst they haven't fallen back too far in terms of the level of customer experience that they were providing in this latest study, It's more that they've now been overtaken by more sort of hybrid or face-to-face interactions. So if we complete the picture looking at non-digital channels, of course, face-to-face interactions by and large were back. We were able to meet people, able to interact at events and face-to-face. And particularly when we look at those company-sponsored events, that's where they've really returned, I think. So if we're looking at the different channels, you see video calls with medical reps leading. Next, it's perhaps those small face-to-face company events and the large events. And then we're looking at video calls with sales reps, and then face-to-face meetings with different types of reps. So something else we're also asking respondents in the survey about was, as you can see with the question here on the screen in front of you, how often do they want to interact with a single pharmaceutical company in any typical month? And it was clear that they had striking similarities regardless of the type of information that they were going for. So across all of those types of content that the industry is providing, for around about 80% of respondents, anything more than 2 interactions a month is just too much for healthcare professionals. Now we are looking at all interactions within this question being the same, so there'll be, I imagine, some nuances within that, but it's a very clear signal from healthcare professionals that they don't want to be bombarded with content, and they don't want to be over-engaged with. And therefore, for pharmaceutical companies, they really need to prioritize the customer experience they're providing so that each and every interaction meets the expectations of their stakeholders. Something else we were looking at in the study was around the content, and specifically the content gaps that healthcare professionals have. What types of content do they want that they're not currently getting? And one of the leading types of content here is new clinical data. In a separate question in the survey, this was the content type that healthcare professionals said was most relevant to their professional practice. But currently, our respondents said that 50% of them had not received new clinical data when they were in the past 3 months. And of those, a full 90%, or just over 90%, said that they would like to receive it. And now we know that new clinical data arrives to some extent when it arrives. It's difficult to predict exactly when it will be ready to publish, but there's a real sense here of healthcare professionals feeling that they're missing out on information that the pharmaceutical industry has and that the healthcare professionals want. And it's not the only type of content where we see a gap. At a similar-ish sort of level is new indication information. But we really do see a building number of gaps where the pharmaceutical industry could be providing information, and it's not at the moment, or at least it's not to all of the healthcare professionals that would like to receive it at the moment. So just sort of parking that idea of this content misalignment for the moment, one of the other questions we asked in the survey was around the level of personalization that healthcare professionals receive from the industry. So specifically, it's a question around healthcare professionals' perceptions of how personalized the content and the interaction that they had was. So it's based on their own personal ideas of personalization. So to delve a little bit deeper, both into the personalization findings, and then also to look at some of the wider customer experience needs of organizations, I'll hand over at this point to my colleague, Hannah Price. Over to you, Hannah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dom. So if we look at the scoring that we saw for personalization, we can see a very similar story to what we saw for the broader CXQ score, which is that there is definitely a little separation when it comes to the experience that farmers or organizations are providing when it comes to personalization. And there definitely could be a substantive lift in the personalization of content to HCPs. So why did we start looking at this as an area? Well, we recognize that there is a requirement now for personalization that is coming through from a consumer perspective in terms of what we see in our day-to-day lives now as outside of the engagement between HCPs and pharma, but we see that expectation now coming into the HCP's engagement with pharma. And this comes down to both the expectations now around what organizations can do with data and the understanding that they have with you. And as we have shifted from more of a rep-based face-to-face model to an omnichannel model, an expectation that high touch, high understanding model that we have when it comes to face-to-face engagement should now be replicable when it comes to a broader omnichannel experience. So what is it that we really see underpinning from a capability perspective for pharma organizations, which is preventing them from being able to achieve movie orders the art of the possible when it comes to both personalization and also when it comes to those CX scores that Dom was showing at the beginning of this presentation? So at DT Consulting, we look at both what we kind of say is the voice of the customer, which is the HCP study. This is what we do, and similar studies that we also have for patients. But we also look at the voice of the business. So these stats are from a report that we do around the state of digital excellence inside the global pharma industry, where we're looking at the internal capabilities of pharma organizations. And we ask pharma organizations to assess themselves when it comes to both their on-stage capabilities, which would be things like their websites, the engagement that they have through different channels when it comes to interacting with HCPs in both kind of digital channels, but also some of those digitally enabled rep channels as well. And then we have the other capabilities here, which are around those back-end capabilities, such as customer engagement analytics, Viva CRM, content creation, channel integration, etc. And we can see here that even though a lot of investment and time has gone into those on-stage channels, with much higher scoring there, around 66% in terms of capability adoption and maturity, we can see that there is still very low scores when it comes to specific back-end capabilities, such as CX management, channel integration, which I think are the elements that are really preventing that uplift that we're seeing, that we're not seeing when it comes to the CXQ score and the personalization score. Move forward in maturity. Well, it is not from a lack of trying. Because at the moment are definitely putting their resource, their time, and their energy when it comes to transformation across all of the 7 elements mentioned on this slide. So change is happening, and we definitely see this inside our story and inside our surveys, that we have seen that transformation is happening, but it's happening at a slow kind of evolution over time. And I think this generally comes down to 4 key barriers that we see inside different pharma organizations. One is sometimes that the strategy around transformation gets lost in translation. There's a very clear mandate that comes through from senior leadership in terms of what we want to use digital transformation for, to enable, to power inside our organization. But sometimes being able to translate that across multiple programs that are running in parallel inside the organizations can be very challenging. And the ability to be able to make sure that that change is happening at the right pace, and that we are connecting different silos together, and that things are amplifying each other when it comes to capabilities that we're building, doesn't happen because there isn't that connected follow through in terms of what was being said in terms of a high level strategy. How does this actually come to fruition day to day in the ways of working on different programs across an organization? especially across the organizational size that we see within large pharma organizations. Then there's also challenges when it comes to process. So if we think about the models of pharma organizations, there's still a huge amount of local autonomy when it comes to different markets and different brands. This means that there's lots of unique ways of doing things within pharma organizations. So if you're now trying to scale and kind of create more streamlined, focused, targeted, cohesive, holistic experiences for HCPs as a customer group, this could be a big challenge when it comes to the fact that you have to be changing and developing and augmenting lots of independent processes that have already been set up inside the organization. There's generally no one way of doing things. There's lots of different ways that are already stood up and have to be taken into account when it comes to any type of transformation effort. From a skill and mindset perspective, I think there is a recognition that change is required, that we are definitely seeing that more organizations now are focusing in on customer experience as something that they see as very important to them. There's a lot of talk now, both in terms of HCP engagement, but also impact on patient when it comes to the mission of pharma organizations. But sometimes we're now looking at, we've been through maybe 5 or 6 years in some organizations of a lot of transformation, a lot of change, especially if people are using agile methodologies. That's change hitting businesses continually. So there can sometimes be a bit of a fatigue when it comes to the amount of change that is hitting teams, as well as still at the same time they're trying to do their day job and they're trying to deliver. So how do we make sure that the changes that we're bringing in as we're trying to improve our ability to perform well when it comes to customer experience are done in a way that people can see how it's going to be impactful to their day-to-day ways of working, and something that isn't going to just be another distraction or another side project that they need to get involved in. And then fourthly, really starting to think more about that organizational structure and design. If we're trying to make sure that we're creating these the whole organization through their journey, through their goals, and through their needs. That means sometimes having to break apart some of the more traditional internal ways that we've structured pharma organizations from a silo perspective, which have been very much more based on those revenue-driven models, which is identifying certain areas which we want to, from an internal perspective, be reporting on, as opposed to actually what is the model that is really going to help us be able to kind of create that holistic experience for HCP. So from our report and from the areas of focus and research that we've been looking at, where do we really think that pharma organizations should target first and to be focusing in on their efforts over the next year? Well, I think from the slides that Dom was showing earlier, especially that one around the content that HCPs want versus the content that HCPs receive, the overinvestment in unwanted content is definitely an area where there's a huge amount of opportunity for pharma organizations. We can really start thinking about what could we do with the resource, the time, the effort that is put into a lot of content that is not currently wanted or required or viewed as valuable from HCPs. How do we make sure that we actually can start thinking about much more targeted content strategy approaches and really thinking about the development of content based on insight and need of that group, and understanding what is it that they want, when do they want it, and how can we create that content, as opposed to just creating a lot of content and then seeing which type of content HCPs are engaging with. There needs to be much more of a feedback loop there to make sure that the content that is engaged with is the content that we continually invest in. I think we could also start thinking about how we continue to reconcile those high-tech capabilities that we're now starting to see become much more pervasive across the whole of the pharma industry with high-touch interactions. It shouldn't be face-to-face versus digital. It shouldn't be rep versus digital. We need to start thinking much more about how we can leverage digital when it comes to the use of reps within an organization, to make sure that we can get the best amplification around that engagement model that reps can help drive within pharma organizations. And then thirdly, start thinking differently about that future customer engagement planning. How do we bring in segmentation and personalization and targeting when it comes to the way that we think about the way that we want to be serving HCPs in the future? can we really think about some step changes that are going to be coming down the pipe in the future when it comes to the way that we want to be able to work? That means that we need to be setting the foundation for that now, especially when it comes to the way that we both capture data and use data on an ongoing basis to be able to start setting ourselves up for success, to be able to create a much more tailored and targeted approach across all channels when it comes to engaging with HCPs in the future. So those are just some final thoughts from us to take away from today's presentation. And I will now hand back over to Sherry.
Awesome. Thank you, Dominic and Hannah, for all of that great insight. What I'll be sharing now is, I would say, supplemental to what the team just offered, which is, they did a lot of survey work of asking and looking at perceptions. What we'll look at now is the behavior actually of HCPs within those digital channels. So thinking about the HCP engagement actually within digital events and webinars. And all of this comes from the On24 benchmarking that we do across, I think it's 1.9 billion minutes of content consumed from 2022 and across 260,000 webinars and digital experiences. So a pretty large sample size of actually behavioral information of how people are engaging when they do join events like you all are on today. And the first thing that we see as unique to this audience set is that HCPs increasingly attend events after the event actually airs. So I know one of the questions that popped into attendee chat earlier is, can we get to the link to the recording? Certainly the behavior we see for the HCP audience is we see a lot of people showing up live, but a lot of people showing up afterwards as well. And this is interesting if you think about the trends that Hannah and Dominic were talking about, which is, how can we increase the simplicity of people consuming information? This is a great way. We know we love to set a time and date for things as marketers. We like to drive urgency to a place for people, but we also have to recognize that this audience has different behavior when it comes to their availability at the set time and date that we are setting for our events. The other interesting part here is that 19% of audiences are showing up both to the event when you're running it, but also showing up afterwards to go back and re-reference your content. So even more important that you make it easy for people to access that content and put it in a place that makes it accessible for people to consume at their own leisure when the time is right for them to digest that content again. And one of the important things to think about, and while yes, this slide talks about how overall HCP engagement increased in 2022 in digital experiences, that means like any interaction that an HCP made while within a webinar or digital event that you were running for them. I actually think that this is a kudos to the industry. I think within this market, there's pent-up demand for engagement to the trends that Hannah was talking about in the personal lives that HCPs have, which is we're used to, through social media, giving a thumbs up, a heart to content that we're consuming. That really drove a lot of the increase in engagement that we saw last year, is making experiences more consumer-like, more interactive. So yes, we saw that engagement increasing for HCPs, but I actually really think that is the reward to the industry and to the marketers who are being more thoughtful as they do mature in the ways that they are creating digital experiences for the HCP audience. Now, especially to the point that Dominic was making about the preferences when it comes to channels, one thing that we've started to track more is how HCPs are attending more and more intimate digital discussions. So if we think about this from the perspective of the data that Dominic shared that showed that the number one non-digital interaction that was preferred was small face-to-face events, certainly that speaks to this need for intimacy and a smaller, more peer-to-peer environment for people. And as we do think about how the market overall, even outside of pharma, has changed, it has really been in how digital is a way to create smaller experiences, which is an evolution across the globe. So HCPs did attend last year from the data that On24 has, and an increased amount of those smaller breakout sessions that we're offering to them. So as you do think about your strategy for engagement through the end of the year and next year, know that you can take these great learnings that we have from Hannah and Dominic related to preferences and think about how you can deploy them across different channels and interaction methods. Now, if we think about what calls to action mean, it really means that at the end of something that we are doing with an HCP, what next best action do we offer up to people? And this, quite honestly, has been an underused area for a lot of marketers in this arena so far. But what we've seen now is that as the market has increased in their utilization of offering next best action for people, to Hannah's point about omnichannel in nature, digital is a great way to offer up a next best action that doesn't have to be done digitally, of course. And those who have actually deployed more calls to action, so offering a next best step for downloading content, attending an event, have seen the reward of HCPs actually engaging with those calls to action, which of course gives us more data, more ways to reach out to them and personalize experiences in the future. Now, the last point before we jump into Q&A, and I do see a lot of Q&A coming in, so shameless plug right now, if you do have more questions, put them into chat or into the Q&A functionality now so that we'll have time to get to them. But from that view of how pharmaceutical companies are actually diversifying their mix, we have seen an increase from the On24 perspective in actually people creating personalized experiences. So in alignment with the research that we're seeing about that being a core pillar for customer experience, marketers are starting to deploy more experiences that have personalized capabilities. And this specifically is referring to the idea of a personalized experience where the content is really well curated to exactly what that HCP's needs are, and then further personalized based on their behavior of content consumption there. So starting to increase more of this. It will take a lot of testing. To Hannah's point, oftentimes we're told we need to do more. And then as teams, actually getting that off the ground does take some time, as I'm sure everyone on the event would agree to today. So with that, we've put a lot on you, but there's also some great questions coming in. So we're going to start to answer those now. I'm going to go through a few questions that I think will be potentially, I don't want to say quick hit, but a little faster to answer. And then there's some more complex questions that we'll go over as well. And so actually, Dominic, the first question that we have is related to this slide that I will bring back up for you. And the question from Sophia is, why are the 4 companies on the right slightly grayed out? So I think this is probably in reference to what the customer experience quotient key means. If if you could answer that for Sophia.
Sure, absolutely. So, so those four companies, we're looking from at Pfizer, Bayer, GSK, and Abbott. Slightly different color there because their scores only fall into the fair banding of scores, whereas with the darker blue, that denotes the good scores.
Perfect. Thank you. I hope, Sophia, that answered your question. Wanted to make sure that we got back to you on that. And then another one, I'm going to pull up your slides again here for you. Oh, and there's a build here, so let me build it for you. So this question is from Hussein, who asks, what is classified as non-digital channels? Does this include MSL interactions?
So MSL interactions are captured in the survey, but then they are, from there, they're still split across digital and non-digital channels. So we've used the shorthand medical reps to donate MSLs. And so as you can see, we've kept interactions in terms of face-to-face meetings, actually in a doctor's place of work, maybe a telephone call. We look at some of the digital channels. We're looking at video calls as well as email reps. So that's where MSLs figure in terms of the channel picture.
Awesome. Thank you so much for going over that. The next question that we have is from, hopefully I don't mispronounce your name, Maybrit. More and more pharmaceutical companies provide an HCP portal to engage with HCPs. How should such portals change to be successful in the future? Not sure which one of you wanted to jump in on that first.
So we actually at DT do quite a lot of work when it comes to the website landscape that pharma organizations operate in. And I think, like you say, portals have definitely been something that we've seen be on the rise as more pharma organizations do recognize that they did have a lot of very disparate brand-based channels, which they had created, lots of different websites, a very large digital ecosystem, could you say, when it comes to all of the different brands and all the different sites they've set up, especially then when we start thinking of HCP sites versus patient sites versus more kind of corporate sites. So I think that the desire to bring in portals for that rationalization of a lot of that type of content and being able to have a clearer one-stop shop for HCPs, definitely a good thing. But I think the challenge that we've seen is that it's still been a little bit of a kind of bun fight when it comes to different parts of that portal experience in terms of where do we start putting branded content? How does that start coming together? And I think that's still been a lot of kind of from a almost outside in perspective hasn't been taken. It's still been very much an inside out perspective from a pharma organization. These are our brands and we want to put these out in a very certain way to HCPs versus really saying, what is it that HCPs want to get out of this experience? Why have they decided to go online and come to a website versus picking up the phone and talking to a rep versus going to other types of content or other types of channels? So I think more research really needs to be done in terms of what are those key areas of focus that HCPs are looking for from a portal experience. And then how do we make sure that we're really creating portal experiences that think about the customer experience, the user experience, the functionality, the content in a way that is really bringing to life and supporting HCPs through their needs for that content. And that could be something as basic as making sure that keywords have been leveraged with inside the internal search functionality on some of these websites. We've done tests before for some of our clients where you search for specific brands and the brand name hasn't even been indexed with inside the internal search engine. So it's not coming up in a very easy way for an HCP to be able to even get to certain types of content. Or maybe more thought done on how the patient support content is also available for HCPs so that they have got content that they can be used with the interactions that they're having with patients as well. So I think it's really about starting to make sure that we have more customer insight connected into the design and build of those portal experiences. And I think we're starting to see more organizations focusing on that. And from that, hopefully we'll start to see better engagement with those types of portals that have been created.
Great. And we have a follow-up question actually from Megan on that topic. So I'm going to stay there before we go to someone else's question. But what is the difference between a portal and a brand website? So I think that's an interesting nuance, since portals are newer based on everything that was just explained. How would you, for someone who obviously has this question, is thinking about, oh my gosh, is that more work? Now I need another digital property to create. How would you think about that, Hannah?
So I think branded websites are very much those we're starting to launch a new brand, or we're starting a new campaign about a brand, very much working with our agency on a specific branded experience for a certain pharma product. I think the portal experiences we're starting to see is where collectively, if we think about something like Pfizer Pro, there we've decided to bring all of the website content together into one specific place for an HCP to be able to find. So that's the portal experience now, where we're starting to say, let's make it easier for HCPs to have one place that they know that they can go and receive all content around a wide range of brands.
Perfect. So we have two questions here that are a little bit more about, I think, the preferred channels. So the first from Vikram is, any insights link to prescriptions of any HCP behavior? Not sure, Dominic, if you'd want to start in on that one.
It's not something that was covered by this particular survey. We can start to get a little bit of an insight into it when we look at the wide variety across the different therapy areas. And we know from previous studies that there are a number of important impacts for pharmaceutical companies, depending on whether they're providing an excellent customer experience or a poor level of customer experience, both in terms of how the healthcare professionals involved would view the company, how well they're supported, but also products as well. So that's in our 2021 study, which is available online.
And a follow-up to that is, what was the most visited websites by the HCPs amongst their preferred digital channels?
That wasn't something that was covered in the study. So we were looking at the customer experience provided when one of a number of different types of websites was visited, but we didn't then break the data out into to look at the different types of properties included in that.
Yeah. So it was more of a focus on the hosted websites from the pharmaceutical side, not necessarily if the HCP started their journey on a third-party site. It was more focused on what the pharmaceutical companies delivered.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just one of those things that the survey wasn't powered to look into.
Well, perhaps, I'm sure we're already starting to think as almost halfway through 2023 for 2024. So, and you got a thank you from that respondent. So thank you for answering that. I do want to be aware of everyone's calendars. We've gone through the questions that we've had. So that is the time that we've had for today's session. I want to thank you, audience, for attending, making sure you have access to those slides. Feel free to participate in the survey. We're always looking for feedback from our audiences. And certainly if you're interested in learning more about how to power your digital engagement, feel free to link on the demo from On24. So thank you, audience, for your time today. And thank you so much, Hannah and Dominic, for sharing your research and your expertise with the audience today.
No, thank you.
Thank you very much.